Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
There are some titles that will follow you through life even after you stop doing the job that got you the title. So for instance, I have former students of mine who still address me as professor. Now, I haven't taught for about 10, 15 years, but I can tell you that I was a professor for 10 years, and I taught law, and I also taught Michigan history. And occasionally bump into a former student, "Hey, professor, how are you?" And that's actually not just like an inside joke. That's actually a legitimate thing, is that people who've been professors are often called professor later in life, even though they are no longer teaching. Likewise, it is with judges. You encounter a retired judge, you can still call them judge. That's a thing. Unless you were kicked off the bench in an ugly fashion and had it taken away from you, in which case they can no longer really call you judge. So a former judge, a former judge in Minnesota, because he'd been kicked off the bench and had lost the ability to be called judge, asked the court to legally change his first name to Judge. And another judge said no. And actually, that's the correct ruling. But the headline from Minneapolis Public Radio, or it could be Minnesota Public Radio, but NPR, judge denies ex-judge's bid to change his name to Judge. So, an actual sitting judge this week denied a request from a retired judge to change his first name to Judge. The judge that we're talking about who wanted to change his name retired from the bench October 10th after the Minnesota Supreme Court suspended him for multiple instances of misconduct. In August, he filed a name change petition to change his legal name from John Peter to Judge John Peter, and then the last name. So the case got assigned to a local judge, and in denying the petition, that judge writes that the application is made in bad faith and with intent to mislead. So if you look up the law in your state, if you're in the U.S., you look up the law on name changes, it'll say that you've got the right to go to court. And they'll say you're petitioning the court, but it's almost always granted as long as you're not doing it in bad faith or with an attempt to mislead. So if you're simply changing your name from Steve to Bob, go right ahead. And I know people who've changed their names, first names, last names, all kinds of things. But every now and then we hear about somebody who wants to change their name to something crazy, or they want to change it to something that's confusing or misleading. And here, the judge would say, the sitting judge would say, it would be misleading for this man to say, "Hi, I'm Judge so-and-so." Because they go, "Oh, that's right, this guy was a judge." But he wouldn't be using that as a title. He'd be using it as his first name. So the court wrote, to permit a former district court judge who's been suspended for abusing his position of authority to regain the title he was stripped of would make the administration of justice a practical mockery. A practical mockery. The applicant is not replacing his first name of John with Judge, but is requesting that Judge be added before John, so he can be addressed as Judge John, and that's what the court wrote in its order. By using the name Judge, the applicant would be holding himself out as a judge, a position he held for 15 years, but no longer holds. I remember a couple of years ago, a guy wanted to change his name to a 4-digit number. And he just said, "Hey, I think that's the way society's going. I want to be a 4-digit number." And the court said, "No, because all our names are spelled out." Now, the question is, what if he spelled out the number? But I don't think he got that far. I think he just gave up. So the court also denied the man's motion to keep his name change petition confidential, but ordered that the home address be redacted from the public records, and that's according to state law. So apparently, the former judge who wanted the name change to Judge had asked that his name change request be confidential, but the court just said no. So NPR News attempted to reach the former judge at 2 listed telephone numbers, both of which were no longer in service, but they left a message on a third. So the state's highest court called his actions on the bench flagrant and egregious, and they suspended him for 9 months without pay back in September. And then, anticipating that he'd retire, the justices also suspended him from practicing law. Because we've talked about this before, that somebody who's about to get in real trouble can often resign and go, hey, I resigned. You can't kick me off the bench. But they took away his right to practice law also. So the Minnesota Supreme Court found that he had wrongly held a hearing involving confidential juvenile matters from a moving vehicle while riding to a family member's swim meet. The justices also found that he improperly ordered an administrator to give his court reporter a raise despite a clear conflict of interest. So at the same time, the justices disagreed on some other findings. So he was accused of a whole bunch of stuff. They found him liable for some of it, but not all of it. And I don't know if the moving vehicle one was the most serious or not, because quite frankly, if he held a hearing involving confidential juvenile matters from a moving vehicle, I assume they're talking about he did that via Zoom. Was he driving or was he the passenger? And then the question then becomes, is the real problem that he can't focus on what's in front of him, or he's making the whole process look like it's not serious? But that's neither here nor there. The point really here is that he was a judge. He had the title taken from him. And so he thought, hey, I'll go to court, change my first name to Judge, or actually just add the name Judge to the front of my name, and then people can still call me Judge. If it's that easy, I might change my first name to Sheriff. I could be Sheriff Steve Lehto. Wouldn't that be cool? I mean, there's all kinds of things we could do if we were allowed to do that. But also, I've seen a couple stories out of countries where they have laws about what you can name your kids. That pops up quite a bit, where somebody will name their kid something really, really goofy, and it makes the news. Then you go, poor kid's got to grow up with that name, you know. But hey, naming of people, naming of children is a whole different thing. But I've known, like I said, I've known some people who've changed their names. I've also known people who've changed their names after they got divorced. And I've known several who not only changed their names, their last names, but changed their first names. Because they thought, well, while I'm here, I may as well. So it's another story altogether. But this one is comical. To me, it's comical. And I'm glad that the sitting judge denied the request. Because, again, you can change your name so long as you're not doing it in bad faith or with intent to mislead. And you might say, what other things might be done in bad faith or with an intent to mislead? Let's suppose that creditors were chasing you. People were chasing you down because you owed them money. And perhaps you change your name to something really, really common to make yourself harder to find. That might be something, I suppose. But nowadays, there's so much other identifying stuff. I don't know if that would work or not. But if you simply took someone else's name, like let's suppose I changed my name to Madonna. But you let's suppose you picked somebody's famous name, or I got one for you. Let's suppose that there is somebody in town who's got a business that's known by their name, Bob Johnson's Towing Service. And I changed my name to Bob Johnson, and I'm planning on opening up a towing service. I can see where Bob Johnson might object to that. Now, he might not object when I go to change my name in court, but that's the kind of thing that I think they're getting at. But it's going to be case-by-case basis. And here's one I never would have thought of. But I've also mentioned before, and we should probably bring this up, is that in Michigan and in some states, the judges are elected. Okay, in Michigan state courts, the judges are elected, and they're up for election every so often. And seated judges are allowed to be on the ballot as the honorable so-and-so. And their opponents obviously don't get to do that. So when you go to vote, you can see who the incumbents are. Again, it seems unfair to me because all other elections, the candidates simply use their names. Bob Johnson, Joe Smith, the Honorable Mark Richards. Why? What? Huh? And it's just something I've been doing for years. And I don't even know how far back it goes. All I know is that's something that is done here. And so that's something to do with names as well. But here we have a guy who is not going to be allowed to call himself judge in the traditional sense. So he thought, hey, I'll change my name to Judge. It didn't work. So that's from NPR. Laura, by the way, sent this to me. Thank you very much, Laura. Judge denies ex-judge's bid to change his name to Judge. Questions or comments, put them below. This talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. You can't use up creativity. The more you use, the more you have.